Welcome to Life on Planet A. We have Tim Buckley here from Climate Energy Finance, and it's been a think tank established in 2002 that works on pro bono for the public interest to address and accelerate decarbonization. So Tim has written more than 100 reports on the global energy transition. So a huge expert. We've already having a great chat. So I'm excited to get into all the nitty gritty of renewable energy across the world in Australia, as well as some interesting topics about how the world is changing. So, I'd just like to kind of get an intro to who you are, Tim. So, can you describe to me who you are and what your favorite thing to do in the world is?
Who am I? Probably most pertinent to this discussion, my vocation is finance, so it's not the environment. That's come later in life, but I have, for the first 20 odd years of my life, worked in global finance. For my sins, I was managing director, head of research at Citigroup, the biggest bank in the world, and in that 20-year time frame, I never met an environmentalist, and I actually never saw any of their research. So I got to where I am today because I was talking to a chief strategist in the environmental movement, and I made that sarcastic comment saying, well, you might have some great product, but it's not hitting the mark because no one in finance is reading it. And anyway, he came back, hired me, and a decade later, I'm still doing the same job. And part of my role is to educate the environmentalists. They're brilliant, they're motivated, they're very altruistic compared to anyone in finance, with no shadow of a doubt. But they need to speak the language of finance if they're going to hit the mark in finance. They've got to speak the language of politicians. So part of my role is to help them on understanding the language of finance. So that's effectively allows me to actually do my vocation, which is both finance and doing something good for the country and planet.
That's awesome. It's very helpful, and everyone needs. I think that's probably the most valuable thing you can help. Money. We need about how much money? Like trillions of dollars to feed the energy crisis. No, the climate change crisis, as well as biodiversity.
It is a huge number. The International Energy Agency talks about $5, 6, 7 trillion a year needs to be invested. Now, anyone, even to me, that's a huge number. It's an impossibly big number to think about, but the world already spends billions of dollars a year on energy. And so, and financial markets, like there's one company called BlackRock, it manages $10 trillion. One company, US, not Australian, and they manage $10 trillion. The money's there. If we get the right policies, we get the right solutions, the finance sector will back it in if we get the right policies. So it's a combination of the government's got to get it right. That means that the community and voters have to get it right, push the government to set the framework, and then get out of the way and let finance do the heavy lifting.
Awesome. It's good to hear. Before we get into all the current state of renewable energy, I'd like to know where your favorite place in the world to go is.
I actually go there every week. I go bushwalking in the Ku-ring-gai National Park. That's my Saturday morning. Yes, I get to spend 2 or 3 hours with some friends walking around in a beautiful national park right in the middle of Sydney, and yet you can't see anyone except other nature lovers, and beautiful water, lots of shade, lots of wildlife, and we're privileged. We live in Sydney, yet we can be in beautiful, enormous national parks within minutes. So that's probably it's called the Sphinx Walk in North Turramurra. So I go there. That's how I start my weekend.
That's pretty good. I try and do the same thing as well. Awesome. So on to renewable energy. You sent me the recent up-to-date EIA report, the International Energy Agency. Is that correct? And so they revised their global targets for renewable energy, the recent forecast, and they increased it by 33%, which from their December 2002 publication. And we briefly, when I spoke to you before, you were kind of shocked they even might have increased this because you alluded to there might be underestimating their predictions because they're fueled by certain companies. So what did you think about this updated forecast? And do you think it's a underestimation, or do you think it's correct?
Yeah, I read the IEA, the International Energy Agency, every day. They put out reports every week. They have been doing that for decades. They're funded, as you said, the key issue is they're funded by the OECD, 20 biggest countries in the world, developed countries in the world, including Australia, for half their funding, but the other half, which they don't advertise, comes from the big energy companies. Now, we all know the biggest energy companies in the world are the problem. They're the fossil fuel companies. So the IEA has been very wrong in their forecasts, fortunately for everyone, because they've been saying that delivering on net zero is really, really hard, and it is hard, but it's nowhere near as hard as the IEA has been forecasting. So for about a decade, I've been attacking the IEA, telling them they actually need to get their forecasts roughly right. And every year, without doubt, they have, without fail, they have upgraded their solar forecast dramatically every single year. And they've also been downgrading their fossil fuel forecasts. So one offsets the other. So as you say, this year, it was a big year, around a 30% upgrade in world deployments of renewables, according to the IEA. But the reality is they've been doing those sort of upgrades every year now for a decade. I still think they're too low by a long way, but they're getting in the right ballpark, because they're now, like even today, they put out a new report saying that the world will peak coal consumption for power generation last year.
Wow.
Didn't see it in their headlines, but that is the core conclusion of their own modelling. Wow. So they're now saying the world is building enough renewables to power all the incremental electricity demand in the world every year from now on. And they're still too conservative, so that forecast is wrong. It's actually underestimating how much. So the good news is coal has peaked. It's peaked in 2023, according to the IEA, and they're actually saying gas use will peak next year in the world, not just in Australia, not in the developed world, in the world. So that's just gas use for power generation, but it is, the IEA has concluded that world's fossil fuel use will peak this decade, and we need it to, because we need to have a livable planet.
Amazing. That did not make headlines at all, did it? I did not. No one had. Yeah, that would. Think, what would happen if that made headlines? Would people be attacking it, or how would that work?
Well, it would be very hard for the IEA to be attacked, given it's funded by all of the major companies who are the part of the problem. They could pull their funding, but that would just make it really overt. The IEA, I mean, I'm not, I've just dumped on them, but at the end of the day, I do read what they write. They've got 400 analysts, give or take, around the world. They've got more resources in analysing the world's energy system than any other organisation. And much as I'm dumping on them, they're trying. They put out very detailed research. Fatih Birol, the CEO, for the last 5 or 6 years, has built up a massive operation in India and in China. My point 10 years ago, when he was first elected, was how can you analyse the world energy market and not have people in China and India, which for 40 years they didn't. To his credit, he took that criticism on board, he's fixed it, and so now they're analysing the largest countries in the world, not just the Western countries in the world. And
great. So he listened to you.
Well, it takes a while, but
that's awesome. That's very impressive. So as you were saying, China and India, all those countries that probably had a big impact in the solar PV market in terms of renewables. In terms of China, they commissioned as much solar PV in the entire world as the world did in 2002 from the EIA's report, and their wind contributions grew up 66% year on year in China, which that's the entire world's solar PV is the whole world. It's just kind of hard to. That's amazing amount of solar PV.
China installs as much wind and solar in the last 12 months as the entire rest of the world. And so we've got to get away from the Murdoch media press, which is very American and very pro-America, and that means it's very anti-China. And so a lot of what we do at Climate Energy Finance is try and actually articulate what the facts are and to balance the spin of mainstream media, particularly where the mainstream media is advertising. Their main advertisers are the BPs, the Totals, the Chevrons, the Woodsides of the world. And so it's very hard for print media in Australia to be unbiased when their major print sponsors are in fact the fossil fuel companies who are the problem. So a lot of what we do is try and actually track what's actually happening in reality. Let's compare and contrast versus the spin put on by the fossil fuel media.
Yeah.
And to me, the number one truth that I've certainly studied for 15 years now is that China leads the world in all of these zero emissions industries of the future. And so a lot of Australians probably lack the hope or the confidence that I have because they don't understand how fast China is moving. And when China moves, it is amazing. The Chinese, they're a dictatorship. They've got a very different political system to us. But when you're investing for multi-decades, like you build a grid transmission, it's going to last for 50 years. You build hydro, it lasts for 100 years. China takes intergenerational thinking in all of their strategies. We have to deal with a 2.5-year political cycle. Yeah. And would you, if you're trying to transform your economy, would you rather someone investing on a 50-year view or a 2.5-year view? And so for all the flaws of the Chinese political system, they are absolutely winning the global race to drive decarbonisation and to dominate these industries. And the amazing thing in the last 12 months, which gets me even more excited, is that under President Biden, America's finally woken up. And so you've actually got America throwing $1 trillion of subsidies on the table to try and catch up with China. I don't care which of them wins because we all win. We all get a livable planet if one of them actually, or both of them, including Europe, including India, including Japan, including Korea, if all of those major economies can make the leaps that China's doing, and they're starting to, then we all get a livable planet and we might actually get a more sustainable lifestyle on the back of it.
That's great. So with China leading the way, do you see, obviously US is pushing forward, do you see any other countries that are pushing forward in kind of retaliation to how powerful China's getting in this market, or is it?
That's probably one of the biggest threats that we are seeing, the breakdown of global trade, because of trade. There's a trade war between China, or rephrase it, trade war between America and China. I don't want to blame the Chinese. The Americans started it. Right. But what they really underestimate is that China's now big and ugly enough now to actually retaliate strategically, and they will, and they are. So that's not great, but you are seeing the breakdown of global trade. But what it's doing is actually inspiring other countries to say, well, hang on, we are actually now tied to China. If we're going to stop using their product, we better build our own products. And so countries like India, Japan, Korea, Europe have all started investing in building out their supply chains to offset their reliance on China. So all of a sudden we've got a race to the top around the world. It's wonderful to see, and we all benefit from it. So I think that's a real highlight of 2023.
Oh, great. I recently saw something about nuclear energy, and I wanted to ask about what you personally think of nuclear. Is it a distraction from our renewable energy push, or do we think it's something that can play part of the energy mix? I saw, I think you posted something, and it was a small percent of China's predictions of the China's energy mix. They have some nuclear plants coming up, even some small modular reactors. And I'm curious what you think of that type of energy.
If we look globally, my answer is completely different. So I'll start on the global because I am technology agnostic, and my starting point is we need to decarbonize. And nuclear, for all its other faults, it is a close to zero emissions technology. So if it can be deployed safely, commercially, viably, it's part of the solution. And in China, in America, in Europe, in Japan and Korea, it's definitely part of their solution. They have the capacity to build nuclear power plants. We don't. So you use the word, is it a distraction? In Australia, it is a political distraction. That is exactly what it is. There is zero chance Australia will build a nuclear power plant. I will bet my house on it. There is zero chance we'll build a nuclear power plant. A, it's illegal, right? B, it would take us 20 plus years to build it if we were starting tomorrow, which we won't be. And why do I pick 20 years? The Financial Times in the UK this week has just announced that the Hinkley Point C power plant, which they have now been building for a decade, is a decade behind schedule.
Okay.
And the cost has just gone up another 20%. They are proposing, the latest estimate is £46 billion. So put that in Aussie dollars, $65 billion to build one power plant. And so when Peter Dutton or Ted O'Brien of the Liberal National Party of Australia says they want to build 70 nuclear power plants, and I'm going, well, one is costing the UK $65 billion. Let's think about the NBN. That would make NBN look cheap compared to one nuclear power plant. So Peter Dutton spruiking nuclear, he is spruiking a distraction. It's all about delaying. The more he can divide and delay and distract the Australian public, the longer his funders, the fossil fuel industry, can keep spewing their product into the global market, their fossil fuel exports. So it's all, follow the money. It's all about the fossil fuel industry distracting and deceiving the Australian voters.
It's unfortunate. But that's this power plant. If the small modular reactors technology get up to speed and can be deployed faster, that's probably different.
It's a really big if. There are no small-scale nuclear reactors being built anywhere in the world outside of China and Russia. So last time I checked, I don't think Peter Dutton's a big fan of Russia or China. Actually, maybe Russia.
Yeah.
But the idea that we're going to import Chinese nuclear technology, I don't think that's part of it. So are we going to wait for the Americans? Yes. I would say let's wait till the Americans have built, I don't know, 5 of them. They're really easy. They're really cheap, according to Ted O'Brien. Let's wait for them to build 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're small, they're modular. The day they've built their 5th one, then Australia can think about it. In the meantime, it's purely a distraction. Now, I'm being really sarcastic because the only SMR that had government approval in America to be built got cancelled last month because it was too expensive. So it's just... They're pushing a technology that's a technology readiness of 2, maybe 3, and we need solutions like wind, like solar, like batteries, like pumped hydro storage, which are all technology ready. They're deployable today, commercially viable, and we need solutions today, this decade, not in 2040.
Yeah. Awesome. It's great to hear. It's great to hear we have technologies to help the climate crisis. So we kind of spoke about different countries kind of challenging America, which is great to hear because they've been in power for maybe a bit too long. So there's the transition from American-led to the multipolar. How do you see this affecting the politics of the moment? Obviously, Australia might be in the middle a bit. Is it going to? It seems like it might even make things better since. But yeah, how do you feel like it's gonna?
Yeah, it's a really key phrase you use, the multipolar. And for 50 years we've had, or maybe 30 years, America's been supreme. There's since Russia's fallen over, or the USSR fell over, America's dominated for all the sins of the Americans, inflicted on the rest of us. But China is definitely rivaling America. I mean, I look at this as there's a brilliant Australian book called The Thucydides Trap. It's not a very positive book. I actually didn't finish it because it was too negative. But what Thucydides is a brilliant Greek historian from 2,000 years ago. Thucydides Trap says when a second power rivals a world power, 80% of the time it ends in world war. So it's a pretty negative outcome. Now we're thinking Greece versus Persia. We're thinking China rivaling America, and China is absolutely rivaling America. So that's a pretty negative note. Let's put it in a positive. President Xi, the president of China, talks about the Thucydides trap and says he is trying to avoid it. And what they're trying to do is do it economically. In other words, if they win the race economically, they don't need to do it militarily. Now, that's maybe my spin. I'm a finance person, but that's what I see. China is taking over from America in terms of manufacturing and leadership, world leadership in all these technology-driven industries of the future. Think batteries, think solar, think wind, think EVs, think hydro, think grid, think smart meters, China, green hydrogen. China is the #1 player in the world, and possibly by 5 or 10 years. leadership over America and Europe. So they're already winning the race economically. So the Thucydides trap is all about the second player taking the first player to war in order to show they're more powerful. Well, China's winning the race economically. So, but anyway, let's stay on economics or the multipolar. The far more positive outcome I see is that as we see American leadership get rivaled, it's not just being rivaled by China. It's actually being rivaled by places like India. And India, for all its faults, is the world's largest democracy. And India and China are not allied. India has been, unlike America and Europe, very self-contained. It doesn't invade other countries like the British have done to every second country in the world. But with India's rise to the centre table as a world power, and that's what it is. India is now 1.5 billion people. Its economy is growing 6, 7, 8% per annum. And again, I'm not saying that Prime Minister Modi is doing it all right, but Modi has done a great job of bringing India into a world power position. And they're not allied with China, and they're notionally allied with America. The Quad is something of Australia, India, Japan, and America. But on paper, we're allies. In substance, we don't need India to ally overtly with America. So long as they're not allied with China, the chance of China, say, invading Taiwan is dramatically diminished.
Oh, wow.
Diminished, not removed. But at the end of the day, the power of Europe, India, America, China, Japan, Korea, a multipolar world system is a lot more stable than two or one powers. So I'm cheering for India because it's the best chance we have globally of peace.
Yeah. That's amazing. We've never seen a multipolar world, have we? Has there been examples in history? Or is there only really one power?
My bias is to European history, and that was never stable, but that's an Anglo perspective. If we think a non-Anglo perspective, Mongolia might argue China has invaded them and the Tibetans, but relative to England or America, China is very pacifist. India is very pacifist. Now, I'm talking in the last 50 years, but at the end of the day, it's the Europeans who invented invading everyone. So if we get away from Europe, that's probably a better place.
Yeah, it could be like a power dynamic in terms of economics, which might not be as wouldn't hurt as many people. It's more just interesting power dynamics. That's really interesting. With China leading the way in terms of the energy sector, I'm just curious. Does Australia need to develop any more strategies to start competing with China in this area, or is it not a competition? Is it more that Australia does want to start selling their energy, so would there be competition in terms of selling? I don't know. I'm not a fan of hydrogen personally, but hydrogen. Is there a space there that Australia needs to be worried about with China, or?
Australia's got to be aware of the geopolitics, the changing global geopolitics, because we are in a very delicate situation. We are an ally, a junior ally to America militarily. Our number one trade partner is China, and America and China are at trade war. And that trade war is getting more intense every month in the last 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and it's bipartisan. It's the Democrats and the Republicans hating China more than they hate each other. So Australia's got to be really careful. We can't afford to do what the previous Prime Minister did of Australia, which is poke China in the eye repeatedly, thinking they're not going to retaliate. Remember, they banned our wine, they banned our lobsters, they banned our coal. They're our customer. We can't afford to poke them and provoke them the way the previous government did. And they did it because America asked them to do it. So being the puppet of America is not good for our country. You can probably gather I'm not the biggest fan of America. We've just got to serve our own nation. And that means not being allied or not being tied to either of them. We've got to actually, that's where India comes in. The Indian Ocean, we share the same ocean as India does. And India's rise is 1.5 billion people. It's also a massive global democracy. There's a lot of affinity. It's the second biggest diaspora in Australia is Indian heritage people. We should be absolutely working with India. We should be working with China, we should be working with America, we should be working with all of them. Ironically, we've got what they all need. We've got the best mineral resources in the world, we've got the best wind and solar energy resources. But as you allude to, the problem I see is we are actually one of the biggest 3 exporters of energy in the world. Unfortunately, we're a petrostate. We export fossil fuels. We're equal #1 LNG, we're #1 by a country mile in coking coal, and we're #2 in the world in thermal coal. We're #3 in the world in aggregate in fossil fuel exports. Now, to have a livable planet, our exports of those 3 commodities have to go to zero. And they have to do it in the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's a huge strategic threat to our economy. But we've got all the lithium, all the copper, all the cobalt, all the vanadium, all the rare earths that the world needs, and we've got more land than you can poke a stick at. We've got a low population density, and we've got brilliant wind and solar resources. So we are blessed, and we can pivot to being a renewable energy superpower, which Professor Garneau has been talking about for 40 years. But to your point, your skepticism on hydrogen I share. How do we get the brilliant wind and solar resources of Australia to China, to Japan, to Korea, to our trade partners, to India? And so something we've been talking a lot about is the idea of exporting embodied decarbonisation. Exporting green aluminium, green zinc, green iron, green lithium hydroxide, copper. Do the refining in Australia and then export the energy embodied in the processed minerals.
That's way better. Such a waste of energy to convert your, your electricity, your molecule into something else. Like all that wasted energy getting to hydrogen. So.
Well, if you take that thought a bit further, we export half the world's iron ore last year and more than half the world's coking coal. So we take all of our iron ore, well, the billionaires do, and BHP and Rio, from the Pilbara. They send it up to Japan, China, Korea. They then send our coking coal from Queensland. And then the Chinese, Japanese and Koreans take the iron ore, take our thermal coal, chuck it all in a blast furnace and out pops steel. Well, we could do that a lot more efficiently if we did some of that processing onshore. And by the way, if you do electric arc furnaces, you don't need coking coal. So our #3 export in our country is threatened structurally with no demand. If we're to have a livable planet, we need to do other things. So the idea of exporting green iron rather than iron ore, do some processing onshore and then sell the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans and Indians our green iron for them to put it in their electric arc furnaces. Perfect, everyone's a winner. We don't destroy or compete with their steel industry. That's their sovereign industry capacity, but we do the value adding. So we export embodied, firmed renewables in the processing of our iron ore before we export. Everyone wins. We partner with our current partners. We help them deliver the energy and industry needs that they have.
That's pretty awesome. Is there, obviously there's a cost in building the factories. Is that cost, do you make that cost back in terms of manufacturing Australia can be a bit expensive? Is that something that you worry about, or is it?
That's exactly how BHP would respond or respond when I talk to them. They love dig and ship. They take our iron ore and they take our coking coal and they dig it up, they stick it on a ship and they send it to Japan. And they make really, really high profit margins and really good returns on investment. The minute you actually have to build a big factory, then their capital investment goes up, their profit margins go down, their return on assets goes down. And that's why they go, well, unless there's a really good price signal, we're not going to do it. Now, the price signal is a price on carbon, and there is no price on carbon in international trade, with the exception of Europe. The CBAM. The CBAM changes everything. So I had a bizarre, really interesting debate with some very, very senior Chinese professors last year, and it was a really interesting discussion because they came out really negative on the CBAM. And I'm going, why? And they explain it, it's a restraint on trade. It's going to hurt Australia and it's going to hurt China. So they were down in Australia lobbying for Australia to work with China to undermine the European CBAM. And I go, hang on, there are restraints on trade everywhere. America puts a 40% import duty on Chinese solar modules. That's a restraint of trade, right? There are restraints on trade everywhere. But to go and pick on the Europeans for protecting their own industry, which is world leading in terms of decarbonisation, and so I'm going, well, hang on, if we take as a given countries act in their own national interest, Europe's leading. This is a positive trade impulse. It's saying anyone that wants to supply Europe has to play by their rules and decarbonise the product as well. And they're going, oh, but it hurts China. I go, well, I just put it in reverse. What if you actually introduce a China CBAM? And they go, oh, that would hurt Australia. I go, yep, and I'd love it. Why? Because it'd give BHP exactly the price signal they need for BHP to pivot to becoming part of the solution. Anyway, the professor I was talking to, we were debating it over a red wine, and he went home. The next day he came in and we spent another 5 or 6 hours debating it. And he said, so if we did a Chinese CBAM, you'd cheer. I absolutely would cheer. It's not what Australia does, it's what the biggest countries in the world do, and we're a supplier to them. And if they demand embodied decarbonisation, we can supply it, and our economy will be a lot better off. So that's the price signal we needed. We need a price on carbon. So it was brilliant to hear Minister Madeleine King this month come out and actually say, in retaliation to Indonesia destroying the Australian nickel industry, ironically, but Chinese money's flooded Indonesia. Indonesia said you can't have our commodities unless you value add before you export them, right? WTO, America and China said that's a restraint on trade. Of course it is. It's Indonesian nationalism, but the Chinese do it, the Americans do it, why shouldn't the Indonesians do it? And by the way, it's China funding it, so they can't really bitch to the WTO, but they did. But in the meantime, Madeleine King's come along, but the Indonesians are doing really, really high emissions refining. They're really using low quality nickel resources, and Australia's quality of resources, our mining techniques, would be so much better for the world. Now, she came out, and so Minister King came out this month and said she thinks Australia needs a green premium and we need a CBAM, which Minister Bowen's been talking about the need for an Australian CBAM, but now our resource minister, who serves our resource companies, is in the same camp saying we need to actually advocate for our national interest and we need to push for solutions that serve our industry. And so I'm cheering for Madeleine King.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, she's not been my favourite minister, but when she spoke about this, it was perfect. It's exactly the answer we need. Now, it all comes down to self-interest. You need the right price signal to drive, and in this case, it was the Chinese and the Americans and the Koreans need the right price signal to make them buy high-quality nickel production, not low-quality. We need to differentiate in the international market so that we source mining sustainably. The Europeans, of course, are a decade ahead of us. They've been talking about the European battery passport. And so, yeah, and they've got all of the European car manufacturers are saying they're signing up for a battery passport, meaning you track, like the big issue, everyone would have heard of cobalt. 80, 60, 70% of the world's cobalt comes from Congo with slave labour. Though it's the worst of the worst mining in the world, but almost every battery has cobalt in it. So a number of European suppliers said they will not buy a battery that comes with Congo cobalt in it. So that's where this passport ideas come from. You can trace the raw materials of all the inputs, and it's revolutionary, and of course Europe's doing it. We need to get behind it. So to me,
that's exciting because the body carbon of these materials is so high. And I was thinking as you're speaking, like it took a while to get the CM up and running in Europe. How would that look in China and Australia? Would that might take a few political, well, for China it might be easier, but Australia, since we have our
Well, if I have a choice, I'd much rather China do it, which it really, I was talking to these 5 or 10 Chinese professors and they go, hang on, you should be on our camp. You should be protecting your economy. You serve the Australian national. Yeah, but we need China to act. It doesn't matter what we do, it's what China does, because they're our #1 trade partner and the customer's always right. So It does matter what we do, like what Minister Bowen's doing with his 82% renewables. That's about decarbonising our economy. That is critically important. But where the maths wins is that for every tonne of carbon we burn domestically, we export 2 or 3 tonnes. Our Scope 3 emissions of the Australian economy, our exported emissions, are huge. We are about 5 or 6% of the world's total emissions. When you include our exports, we're about 1.5% of the world's emissions when you only look domestically. So it's what happens in our traded sector, our export sector, and to put that in a positive, we could also help decarbonise Japan, China, Korea and India. We can help them decarbonise their economy. We can decarbonise our own economy in the process. We can build massive competitive advantage globally by exporting embodied decarbonisation. So if China, and maybe the other aspect is China's actually well ahead of Australia, as usual. They introduced a national carbon trading scheme 2 years ago. So carbon pricing in Australia is toxic thanks to the previous mob, but we were a world leader. The Chinese copied it, they replicated, they implemented it, of course, and they have a national ETS for the power sector, for the electricity sector. They're looking to roll it out to another 7 or 8 industry sectors probably this year. So you need to have an internal carbon pricing framework before you can put a CBAM in. Ironically, America's threatened China with a CBAM, and I'm sitting there going, America's worse than Australia, but they don't even have a carbon price at all. We've at least got the safeguard mechanism, thanks to Minister Bowen. They don't have that, yet you've got Republican senators wanting to bring in a carbon border price on...
They don't even know the logistics of trying to do it.
I have no idea, but anything that's anti-China, they're for it, and bring it on.
So funny. America's funny. I feel like they just say things and just
think through the implications. I'm cheering for that one, that Republican. It was actually proposed as an act of Congress last year by 3 Republicans. I go, really? I mean, Donald Trump wants to tear America out of the Paris Agreement, he did, and yet 3 of his Republican senators are cheering for a carbon price on imports. But at the end of the day, they're arguing it's about protecting American industry. It's always about self-interest. Nations work in their own self-interest, but we all have to live on this planet, so bring it on.
Awesome, yeah. I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on Trump. Do you think he's the least helpful president, or is there any redeeming qualities that you see about him?
There are no redeeming qualities whatsoever, if he gets back in, it will put America, it'll certainly be the end of the American empire. Oh, it's dead. He said, now, although what Trump says and what he does are 2 different things, because the guy can't even remember what he said yesterday. But he swore he will tear it apart. But do you want to ask about...
I guess we'll move on from Trump because he's not going to help the energy transition. So, but
let me interject, because if Trump does get in, you are going to have the American industry have a massive problem, because the industry, if they let Trump tear down America's efforts in decarbonisation, in batteries, in EVs, in energy, cost of everything will go up in America, and industry knows that they are never then going to catch China in all these industries of the future. The Chinese will cheer because that just gives them world domination of nuclear, of hydro, of grid, of batteries, of EVs, of solar, of rare earth refining, of cobalt refining, of nickel refining, everything. China dominates these industries, and so it would actually isolate American industry and leave them. So I think you'll find that once he gets in, he'll actually quickly backtrack and realise that there are so many employees now in battery factories and EV factories in America, and they're mostly Republican states. So the reality is the IRA has transformed the American economy, and he'd be... Well, we know he's stupid, but he would be damaging his own supporters by ripping it up.
Yeah, he's probably just trying to attack Biden at the moment.
Correct.
That's his strategy. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. When we're talking about people, I'm really curious about the CEOs and what kind of impact they're making in in energy transition. We mentioned Meg O'Neill and Richard Goyder, and how I'm just curious how these two people are shaping Woodside, because they're a big company, and if they're trying to transition, yeah, how are the CEOs helping us with this energy transition, if at all?
CEOs and chairs are really powerful. Now, we don't want to make it a personal issue, but at the end of the day, when you have tens of thousands of people working for the CEO, and the CEO sets the mandate, and then the board, led by the chair, endorses the CEO or gets rid of the CEO, they become critical. And I think Woodside is a danger to the planet because they constantly ignore the advice of people like the International Energy Agency, which very clearly says that for us to have a livable planet, for us to have a chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees, the world cannot afford any new greenfield development of any new fossil fuel in the world. And what's Woodside doing? It's building 3 of the new biggest greenfield fossil fuel developments in the world concurrently right now. And then also not investing in renewables. They're not investing in any material way in solutions. So they're not using their market power, their balance sheet, their cash flow, their significance to our economy in anything other than to perpetuate the destruction of our planet. So I think Richard Goyder, as chair, has failed in his duty, which is to appoint a CEO who's actually going to lead the company in a constructive way. And so between Meg O'Neill and Richard Goyder, they are absolutely taxing the next generation and potentially threatening the viability of our economy and our world. And I don't know how they sleep at night. At the end of the day, they can pretend, if not our LNG, someone else's LNG, but they're helping destroy. That's the drug pushers argument. They are drug pushers. And they should be ashamed, and they should know better. I mean, Richard Goyder, very successful CEO in his own case, CEO of Wesfarmers, but totally failing in my view. And so we need board renewal. We need leadership who actually is willing to work in a framework that says a livable planet can't be sacrificed in order to maximise their near-term profits. It's just a fool's errand.
Yeah, they say it's a transition fuel, which is just, the biggest hoax. But I'm curious which CEOs you feel like are, in particular, ones in fossil fuel industries that are trying to transition, because there are a lot of big names out there. Like, do you think, they're built on fossil fuels. How can they work in a decarbonized world? Are they going to try and just build renewables, or?
Yeah, I'll try not to swear, but I was a big fan of Bernard Looney.
Okay.
Like, he was the CEO of BP, and I have never in my 35 years of studying CEOs seen a CEO give a maiden speech. So Bernard Looney gave a maiden speech, not just to all of the 100,000 people that worked for him, but to all of his shareholders globally and to all the governments he works with. And BP is a global company, and he gave a maiden speech. Now, politicians give maiden speeches, but the CEO of BP got approval from his board that on his first day in the job, he gave a maiden speech. 90% of it was about how he was going to transform BP to align with the climate science. And so I was cheering for him. And for other reasons, the arrogance of being a CEO got to him, and couldn't keep his pants on. And so he's now gone. And it's a real loss, because he was illustrative that one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in Europe, in the world, was trying desperately to transform. Now, he got sideswiped by a third of their assets were in Russia, and then Putin invaded Ukraine, and Russia became uninvestable. And then, so there are other factors, but at the end of the day, it's really, really hard for a company. We talked about Woodside, for every single employee of that company has to get up to, and every day they have to deny the science to do their job. And then you want them to turn around and actually invest in the solutions at the same time they're destroying the planet. It's the wrong person. It's the wrong 10,000 people, and it's the wrong CEO. So the financial markets were betting that Bernard Looney would fail. He did fail. He failed faster than they thought because of Putin and because he couldn't keep his pants on. But it was a critical opportunity to show that these dinosaurs could survive. And I call fossil fuel companies dinosaurs. They have to die. For us to have a livable planet, they have to die. Woodside has no future. They will keep pumping out their pollution for the next 10, 20 years. They'll be quite profitable in doing that, potentially, but they will not be part of our economy in 20 years' time. They can't be, because the economy will be dead if they are. So the Woodsides, the Santos, the Whitehavens of the world have to die. But the good news is there are actually only a few of them. Like, that's why, I mean, when I was going to throw in Glencore, but it's a Swiss company. It's a big player in Australia. But if you look at the Australian companies, like, we've got three massive dinosaurs. BHP was a dinosaur. BHP was one of the biggest oil and gas and coal companies in the world. So was Rio Tinto. But Rio Tinto, for various reasons, and I worked against them and then with them, they sold their last coal mine in 2018.
Wow.
BHP has got probably 80%, 90% of their fossil fuel production off their books. Now, it does beg the question, does divestment make any difference when you divest your oil and gas assets to Woodside, another very powerful Australian company? You've done nothing to help the economy pivot.
No.
And so when the BHP CEO stands up and goes, oh, but we've pivoted out of fossil fuels into future-facing mineral, and by the way, that's exactly what he says. We pivoted out of oil and gas and out of thermal coal and out of coke and coal, and we pivoted into nickel and copper. Aren't we great? They bought Oz Minerals for $10 billion last year. But it didn't have any real-world impact. So it's an absolute waste of time, and it's a denial of the reality. We actually need to invest in solutions, and we need BHP to lead. Divestment doesn't work. It has no real-world impact. Now, it has a role, don't get me wrong, and I've worked with a lot of people that work on and are devoted to divestment. It changes the political landscape. It changes the social license. It changes the imperative of the companies and, more importantly, the investors behind the companies. We need those companies to change. So thinking about other companies, I worked 2 years ago on AGL. Now, AGL was Australia's largest carbon polluter by a country mile. And thankfully for Australia, Mike Cannon-Brookes came along. And fast forward 18 months, AGL is part of the solution. Not a big part of the solution. Like, my words to the CEO was, run a lot bloody faster than you are, but at least he's taken the company in the right direction. 5 of the 9 directors on AGL's board were new as of last year, and they all accept the science, the climate science, as a starting point. So AGL's gone from being the biggest problem in the domestic economy in Australia to now being part of the solution. And even look at their advertising. I get a lot of questions, is AGL's advertising greenwash? Is it lying? And it's not. They're talking about electrify everything and how AGL wants to help people electrify and decarbonise. That is the future. The board understands it. The CEO understands it. Now, the dilemma they've got is how fast they can run. When they, 2 years ago, AGL had no capacity to build wind, solar and batteries. Now we're saying we want you to invest $1 billion or $2 billion bucks a year in batteries, wind and solar, and they're going, well, we actually don't have the expertise to do it. We'll build it quickly or buy it, but do it because the world needs it, Australia needs it, and they're building it internally. So they're pushing, give us another year as their response. We are doing it, and they are. They're building one of the biggest batteries in the world right now at Liddell, and they're building another one of the world's biggest batteries right next door. So they're transforming.
That's great. I worked for Engie Impact as a consultant, but as the consulting arm of Engie, and I always kind of heard through the grapevine how hard it was for them to build in Australia wind and solar and even acquire. Like, I'm just curious, is Australia a hard market to build in solar and wind? Like, why would Engie have an issue with that?
Problematic for them. Engie went through an enormous transformation 10 years ago. They were one of the dinosaurs. They were worse than AGL. Well, okay, they were as bad as AGL. Now they're a European leader. But it took enormous pain for shareholders, for management, for the staff, for the workers. Culturally, they had to transform the entire company. but they have done that, and they've come out, and they're now a massive force for good. So we need companies to succeed. So I was just thinking I'm just promoting a company, but we need those companies to transform, because we need their balance sheets, we need their management, we need their staff, and we need their cash flow working on solutions. What you can't have is a Woodside pumping every day, waking up, and all their staff undermining the viability of our planet. That's what Woodside does every single day. So why is Australia a hard market? It's because the political landscape in Australia is so divisive. And it comes down to one word I used earlier: we're a petrostate.
Right, we're still like in that.
We are still the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. The fossil fuel industry exported $220 billion of fossil fuels from Australia last year alone. They made an obscene $150 billion gross profit last year alone from from Australian exports of fossil fuels. $150 billion a year is a massive problem. And so the idea that we're going to become a world leader in decarbonisation when we've got one industry sitting there self-serving and making $150 billion of profit, that buys a lot of politicians.
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate. But as you said, Chris Bowen is doing a lot of good work to push renewables. Is he doing things to push out fossil fuels as well, or is that separate?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. He'll flick that problem to Tanya Plibersek. It's Minister Plibersek's problem. She's the one approving new fossil. In other words, it is the dilemma. The ALP, I mean, certain podcasters call them shit light.
Light. Yeah, I've heard that.
Taking fossil fuel donations.
Yeah.
But I am a fan of Minister Bowen, but part of why I'm a fan is because he's got to deal with David Pocock. And I would not want to be standing against David Pocock. He is a brilliant man. He's got 6 brilliant teals standing next to him. And so what you've actually got is a real change in the Australian political landscape, where we've gone from the two-party system to multi-parties. We've got the Greens, we've got the ALP, we've got the Liberals, and then we've got a whole powerful set of independents, and most of them are really brilliant women who are very eloquent. David Pocock's not a woman, but he's very eloquent. And he's bloody tough. And so what we've actually got, because the LNP is missing in action, Dutton just says no to everything. So the ALP has no choice. They have to negotiate up with the Teals and the Greens every time they want to do anything. So every time Bowen wants to do something, like the safeguard mechanism, he's got to deal with Sophie Scobbs, or he's got to deal with David Pocock, or he's got to deal worse, even with the Greens.
Oh no!
He can go even further. And so he gets ratcheted up in his ambition if he wants to get his legislation through. So when I'm calling out, Bowen's done a great job, but it's because David Pocock's standing behind him saying, "You better go harder."
That's awesome.
That's a great outcome for Australia.
That's cool. I love it. Yeah, the safeguard mechanism. I've been to some of those working groups, and it's really, because I used to like audit the safeguard mechanism. I even helped coal mines be compliant and lower their baseline, which I regret. That's okay. But yeah, it's great that you can see that baseline moving down. And so are you?
There's a lot of work to be done. I took on a lot of environmentalists. A lot of environmental groups were dead set against safeguards because it enables carbon credit offsets. And the offsets market in Australia has a lot of problems. And the idea that any fossil fuel company is going to be able to offset their way out of the problem, not going to happen. But at the end of the day, because carbon pricing, because of the Tony Abbott is politically toxic. And so if you can't talk about carbon, if you can't do the best solution, like put a price on carbon, let the market solve for it, that's the obvious thing. Almost every economist would agree that's the obvious solution. That's politically toxic. So we're going to go the fifth best solution. The safeguard mechanism is the fifth best solution, but it's there, it's credible, it's got teeth, it ratchets down the emissions by 5% every year. It's complicated, but I think it's a really good step in the right direction. And by the way, we're not losing any industry over it. That's the threat, the wrecking ball. Tony Abbott, threat, Hogan slogan, word. And you have
Same. So,
but
yeah.
Sally Steagles
Yeah, me too.
put him out of
Yeah.
office, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
But that he used to claim it was a wrecking ball for the Australian industry, and it's not. It's not
No.
proven to be a wrecking ball at all. And in fact, we're now talking about the reindustrialization of our economy
Yeah.
so that we can service the embodied decarbonisation and help all of our trade partners decarbonise. So it's become a multi-$100 billion investment
Yeah.
opportunity for Australia, far from a wrecking ball.
No. Well, that's exciting. So I just want to have some closing thoughts. So what advice would you give people to help them? Someone they asked you like, "Oh, is AGL greenwashing?" How do you help people even debunk that or like misinformation if you're not really in this space? Which obviously might take some digging, but there's some greenwashing legislation coming out in Europe, which is exciting, like hard rules against what is greenwashing. But I guess on a day to day, how did an individual? Is there?
I'm actually a fan of Jim Chalmers, the treasurer, as well.
Oh yeah.
And one of the reasons is he has mandated the Australian regulators,
Hmm.
so that's ASIC, APRA, um, and the ACCC. So they're in regulating, and they've come out fighting,
Okay.
saying they will take any company that greenwashes to court
Wow.
because
Okay.
it is investor and consumer deception.
Mm-hmm.
Right, my words, but
Yeah.
that's actually the words of the SEC as well, the
Oh, great.
Securities Exchange Commission, the most powerful regulatory body in the world, not Australian, obviously, it's American.
Mm.
But if the SEC says they will sue you for greenwashing,
Yeah.
companies will get out of the way. Now, they
Okay,
won't
cool.
because of Trump, but in Australia, our regulators are actively warning corporates and financiers to beware. If they greenwash, then the ACCC will take them to court.
Oh, great.
So that's a pretty good stick, and Jim Chalmers is funding those three organisations, the regulators, the traffic cops, to actually try and keep the companies online. Now, there's a bit of a pushback because the rules, as we were talking about earlier, the rules are still vague. What are scope 3 emissions?
Yeah.
Net zero emissions, and what are the risks? Now, if all of a sudden you've got the regulator saying, oh, by the way, if you screw that up, we'll sue you.
Oh.
Directors are really fearful of being sued,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a fiduciary duty as directors of companies and as trustees of superannuation money. So they are fearful. They're going, hang on, you're asking us to walk in the right direction, but you're telling us we can go to court if we get the direction wrong or we say the wrong thing. Now, my advice to them is that's crap. You're walking in the right direction. You know what is an outright lie. You know how to actually talk about we're going in the direction. We're not compliant with a livable planet, but we're moving towards compliance with a livable planet. You can actually frame it pretty easily with a few minutes with a lawyer to avoid lying to your customers, your shareholders, or your investors. So
Okay, great.
and the traffic cop, the regulator has come out and said, look, they're not trying to trip people up who are doing the right thing.
Right.
They're trying to get the ones who are lying.
Yeah, that's fair.
Deception. There's a big difference.
There's a difference.
Honest mistake and deception.
Yeah.
But it is the law, and if the law is vague, so it's important the regulator repeat that they're after the ones who are lying deliberately to deceive, as opposed to they made an honest mistake.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so I'm pretty confident with our Treasurer Chalmers and the Finance Minister Katie Gallagher telling the regulators to police greenwash, telling the financial institutions they have to disclose their scope 1 to scope 3 emissions, they have to have transparency. We're moving in the right direction. So you can have a reasonable degree of confidence when AGL now advertises. Like 5 years ago, AGL was trying to sell us that natural gas was healthy. Methane gas, and it's toxic. It's what it is. If AGL tried to run their natural gas ads these days,
it wouldn't work.
Warning them is deception. They now know it, and they will get sued for it.
That's funny.
Where the ACCR and the Environmental Defenders Office will be all over them. So
awesome.
Plenty of good, powerful NGOs watching.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I'm happy with that. Awesome. Oh, such a good, amazing chat. I've learned so much. Since this is the podcast Life on Planet A, I like to ask at the end, what is the meaning of life to you?
My meaning of life, I started by saying, is my vocation. Being able to leave the world a better place.
Yeah.
But being able to every day just work towards a positive solution.
Yeah.
Finance is my original industry, my vocation, but it's a pretty soulless
Yeah.
industry. So to be able to work in finance, I work with financiers every day,
Mhm.
but to actually work in the public interest is, yeah, let's try and hope
That's
make
awesome.
the place a bit better off than it was.
You're using your vocation for good, and yeah, really great work you're doing. So, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate you giving your time, and yeah, thank you. Learned so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome.